Hey friends, Deuteronomy 25 through 28 today. As usual, a lot going on. We have big pieces to kind of bite off each day here with 4 chapters, and chapter 28 is a long chapter. I'm enjoying reading this, and as I mentioned yesterday, a lot of Deuteronomy actually, kind of surprisingly, not really Leviticus or Numbers, but Deuteronomy in particular, some sections more than others, not the beginning that seemed pretty straightforward. But a lot of this makes me know how much I don't know, and again, how much doing some research can yield a lot of good results. There's a book that I have here on my shelf, and I don't suspect that it's necessarily the best of anything, but when I've opened it, I found it to be helpful, and it's one volume. It's actually based off the New Living Translation, which is kind of unusual for commentary. But this covers Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, not in huge depth on each thing, but will give some kind of baseline help for the kind of things that we're kind of thinking about. So that's one I think it's relatively inexpensive for covering three books of the Bible. So that's one you could potentially add to your shelf if you kind of want to have some resources. And I would suggest that as time goes on, in particular, if if reading and understanding the Bible is a priority to you, which I think it should be, at least it is for me, gaining some resources, not, stacks and stacks like I tend to have and still don't know that much, right? But some resources can be helpful. So I'll try to recommend the kind of things that I feel like are accessible enough that aren't going to be in depth. So I've ordered a couple more things today. I've realized I have a much bigger New Testament library than my Old Testament library, and there's several books of the Bible that I don't have really hardly any in-depth kind of resources on. Another good series, especially if you're looking for stuff that's when I say accessible, I mean doesn't require a lot of theological jargon, doesn't really require or expect any knowledge of the original languages like Hebrew in this case of the Old Testament. So one that I ordered as well is in this series. So this series in general, and again, with any commentary series, not every volume is going to be equally as good depending on who wrote it, etc. But this series, the NIV application commentary, is very also accessible and tries to draw some application as well, although that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking to it more for understanding than for application. But I just ordered this one for Deuteronomy. The author is Daniel Block. He's at Wheaton, and is a recommended scholar. So yeah. So there's that, and again, are you going to want to build out a library? Maybe not. If you're looking for resources in your local, let me know. I do have a lot of things, and if I don't have it, I'll probably buy it so that you can take a look at it. So let's jump back in here, 25 through 28 today. I've also been wrestling with a little bit the last couple of days, thinking about the idea of and again, Justin, I'm looking at baseline stuff for recommendations here, not necessarily the depth or the best of the best kind of thing. So one of the things that I know you're interested in this topic, Justin, if you're still there, as far there's different ways for us to read the Old Testament as Christians, right? As new covenant believers, we can, and it's very valuable to read the Old Testament through what we might call a Jesus lens, right, or a Christ-centered lens, because, probably for a lot of reasons, but Jesus says, that all the scriptures, testify to me, right, and so we acknowledge, right, those of us who are Christians, that this story leads to Jesus. And so now as Christians, it's very appropriate for us to go back and read these stories and these teachings in light of where we know that they're going to find their culmination in Christ, right? That Jesus is the fullest revelation of God that we have, the Word made flesh. And that is a significant interpretive key to all these things. And so I'm in on that. At the same time, what I've just kind of decided to do, and again, there's no shade towards that reading. So that reading, we're looking to see, where is Jesus here? Or how does what Jesus does with these texts, affect how we read back, read them now in light of Christ. Very valuable again. But what I've decided to do is not primarily take that as the kind of first approach for this study. What I want to kind of do is put myself in the situation of just kind of, if I was just opening this book from start to finish. Now I can never get Jesus out of my mind. And so I'm thinking about, what he does with things, kind of how he provides the, I would say, a sense definitive interpretation of them. At the same time, I want to kind of soak in this time and place. What would it have been like to receive these instructions? What would it have potentially been like to be these people at this point in the journey, not having the full revelation that we have of the whole of the biblical story of Scripture, and of course the revelation of Jesus himself. So hopefully that makes some sense. And again, like, it's not like a "this is right" kind of thing, but I want to not just say where's Jesus for this particular study. Now, as we get through, because we're doing the whole Bible this year, as we get there, as we get along in the story, Old Testament story itself, but in particular with Jesus, we're going to be very, very, very much attentive to when Jesus refers to, or when the apostles refer to or allude to so many of these things that we're now soaking in the Old Testament. I'm going to very specifically want to draw attention to those things. It's going to be hard to do because we're going to have a big scope of Scripture again too. But I want to be because we've already thought through the story as it's unfolding here. What I want to do again very specifically is when we get to when Jesus quotes, from the Torah, from the prophets, we'll have that hopefully already now in our background, having walked through it, so that we can see how the story continues to unfold. But if I was just taking a piece here, or for a sermon or a talk, I would want to talk about this in light of Jesus as at least part of that message. But because we're doing this particular task where we're soaking in and we're moving through the story as we find itself, I am going to mention Jesus, of course, but it's not going to be primarily where is Jesus. The other thing is, of course, that because we know who Jesus is also here. The theological concept of the Trinity, and we realize, Jesus, all things were created, through him and for him, and these things we later know. But there's so much to kind of wrap our minds around. But jumping in and just picking out a few things here again, both that seem interesting or that we'll need to understand future pieces of the Old Testament story. Do not, so chapter 25, this is just an interesting one. Do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain, okay? And some of these are longer sections. Some of them are just like longer section and then boom, like this one, where it's like, okay, where'd that come from? And then next thing is not necessarily, directly in the same kind of subject matter, but it all kind of ties together. But just a couple interesting things to mention here with this: do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. One thing that it's interesting that it says to me is that God, Moses, the law, this, however you want to kind of think about this, is concerned about even how animals are treated. It's just this big picture, how the land is treated, how people are treated, right? We see that again and again and again. But even like, it's not right to have this ox who's doing this work for you, to not be able to eat, to enjoy, some benefit from the work that they're doing along the way. So even animals as part of the big picture. Remember, God cares about it all. This big picture, he created everything good, and he made us as humans responsible for, have dominion. Doesn't mean abuse. It means take care of, right, as part of it. Everything. The other interesting thing about this, and I said I'm not doing all New Testament stuff, but because I may or may not mention it there, it's interesting that Paul picks this up, this teaching here in the law, and he applies it to people who are serving as ministers in the church, and being able to kind of have some financial support for what they're doing. And it's interesting that he goes back and references this as being applicable to that. And that's just one interesting kind of instance of saying that it's not that when we get to the New Testament that these things just become completely irrelevant. Now there's a new lens, certainly given to them, new application. But in this case, Paul references this principle as applying in a different way, but the same idea. So that's really interesting, and I'll try to tag that when we get there way later in the year, right? The next section that follows in verse 5 and after is this concept that is often referred to as levirate marriage. It's important background for the book of Ruth that we'll see as we move forward in the story. Levirate marriage is something that's not that familiar to us unless we've learned about it through the Bible study. It's not something that we do today, but it's a means of care for some important things in their ancient world, in their society. One, to provide for their extended family, and two, to provide a line for a person. Remember in the genealogies, like everybody matters. Their family line mattered to them immensely. They had land assigned to them that they wanted to stay in the family. We saw some issues and concerns come up with this along the way as well too. So this is that's confusing to us, and it is in a sense because it's different. But I want to tag in where's the foundations for these things that happen later in the story, so at least we can understand what's going on in those stories. It gives us the sort of background. So basically, verse 5, if brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. And a lot of that is because, again, of this, I think, the land allotment and this kind of thing, keeping the clans and the tribes and stuff together. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first, and this is interesting. So if you're a man, you have a brother, he gets married, but he dies for whatever reason before they're able to have a child. Now he has no family line, and his wife, who's now a widow, has potentially no one to care for her. So two concerns there that are going on. This is the solution at this point. This happened in other cultures, I'm understanding too, in the ancient world, but it was a way to take care of the concerns here. So then the brother is to take her as a wife so in verse 6, the first son she bears will carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. So this is interesting to this idea of names being written and names being blotted out. That'll come up later, like in the book of Revelation, way at the end of the story, kind of names in the book of life. So this is interesting, this idea of names written and names blotted out of the story. But again, the idea is that the family line will continue on. The inheritance, I think, will continue on. That's kind of part of the thing. And the kind of the people's legacy. And remember, I've pointed out already that where you go after you die is not the core part of the story here. It's very much either living long in the land, experiencing the blessings of walking with God, right, in this covenant relationship, and also kind of one's family line continuing on. Remember, this is promises to Abraham. Your descendants will have a land. Your descendants will be as numerous as the sand on the seashore, the stars in the sky, and those kind of things. So all that's wrapped up in here. Even though it's odd to us, it still is kind of a challenge to this, the foundational Genesis idea of the one man, one woman. In this case, that complicates that a little bit too. So I'm far from expert here, but again, just kind of check that as the kind of foundational stuff here. A weird one continues in verse 11, maybe to us, but I think it does make some sense. If two men are fighting and the wife of one of them comes to rescue her husband, and she reaches out and seizes him by NIV private parts. The idea here is testicles. Why is that important? Reproduction, which is in the whole story that we've sort of looked at. So a heavy consequence there, her hand. So, and again, I've mentioned, we are, I think rightfully, troubled by violent consequences, substantial consequences for these things. And again, this is where the Jesus lens interpretation will come back. What does he do carrying these things forward will become very important. But don't, again, I did a little rant about this one time. When the consequence is severe, instead of saying, ooh, that doesn't sound like, Jesus to me, instead of only going there, focus in on, this is a big deal. If there's a severe consequence, it's probably a big deal, and let's at the least take very seriously what that big deal is as we wrestle with consequences. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, feel free to kind of engage or jump in on some of these things as well. Very, I think, just more evidently, maybe it takes a little bit of a step, like in verse 15. And again, all these things are kind of put together. But this happens. Jesus does this with different kind of ethical teaching together. Paul does this. Like one example would be like Romans 12. We're just kind of going in and listing off things for them to think about, kind of ethical imperatives. And so it's not unusual that we would have things like that. But this may seem evident, but also points to a potential way of being dishonest or cheating. So I'm still in chapter 25 here, verse 13. Do not have two differing weights in your bag, one heavy and one light. Verse 15. You must have accurate and honest weights and measures, so that you will live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. For the Lord your God detests anyone who does these things, anyone who deals dishonestly. So what's going on here, right? When they would buy and sell goods, they would be weighed out, to know how we do this. Still today, it's all digital, the scale in the grocery store, right? But in markets, they would weigh out, and they would have simple weights that were kind of the default weight, whatever that was. For us, it could be ounces or pounds. You would use, okay, what's a pound of whatever? I have this pound weight. I put it on one side of the scale. I put the thing that I'm buying or selling on the other side of the scale. And so what is being said here is don't have one weight that favors you when you're buying, right? And then a different weight that favors you when you're selling, because that's dishonest. So this is a good example of something that, and why, we need to really discern things in here, because this is something that's pretty easily directly applicable, right? I mean, not directly in the sense that we have the stones in our pockets and that's how we weigh things, but the admonition here is you deal honestly. You treat others the way you'd want to be treated, right? Okay, Jesus, golden rule, which is those kind of statements are even built in, we've seen along the way in the Torah as well. So that it's expected, there's no punishment here given, but just a reminder that it's expected that you're going to be honest in your dealings, which is something that is kind of applicable as well. In chapter 26, the first fruits and the tithes, we've seen this already in the in our in our walk through these scriptures so far. And it's interesting to me the times when people are instructed to either say something specific or to make something or to communicate something. What are the times where it's specifically encouraged to say or do or repeat a specific thing? Because that becomes kind of anchor moments, I think, right? Times where that's really wanted to be emphasized. And some things are emphasized and some aren't. And again, as we'll move forward in the story, there's some things from the Torah, Old Testament, that Jesus doesn't mention at all. There's other things that he mentions often or frequently or boldly. And so we need to discern a lot of things as we walk through here. But I just want to say that this is not going to seem like anything new because it's something I've highlighted very regularly, not because it's important to me, it is, but because repetition is significant in when we do Bible study. Repetition is significant for what an author is trying to get across here. So let's look at verse 5 of chapter 26. Then you shall declare, this is when you're bringing in your tithes here. Then you will declare before the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down into Egypt. Now, this is not literally their father, like my dad. This is the connections of the big family, right? Ancestors, and this is referring back, right, to Jacob, and it was Israel and his 12 sons. My father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down into Egypt with a few people who lived there and became a great nation, powerful and numerous. But the Egyptians mistreated us and made us suffer, subjecting us to hard labor. Again, this is all being, remember this. This is as time goes on, it's not, it goes from being your father to your grandfather to your great grandfather to your great great grandfather. And as time goes on for the people, they're more historically distant from a season, a time, but they're instructed to remember. Don't forget these things. And for us that's similar as remembering the cross. Remember Jesus giving his life for us. That even though we're 2,000 plus years removed from that, we want to sometimes envision or imagine that we're there. Envision or imagine that we're the disciples, in the boat or whatever. Don't maximize the distance in identification, minimize the distance, and associate yourself with these times of God's provision, of God's deliverance. Connect yourself with that by saying these things on a regular basis as you go through this particular practice. But the Egyptians mistreated us. Okay. So the Lord, verse 8, so the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm. He brought us to this place, and he gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now I bring the first fruits of the soil that you, Lord, have given me. We saw this earlier in Deuteronomy already. When things are good, when we see the kind of cycle working very naturalistically, like, okay, I planted the seed the same way an atheist or a Baal worshiper planted it, and I see it grow and whatever. Don't forget that the land that you're in is because of God's gift, right? The rain that flows is because of God's gift. Keep that perspective and that thankfulness that the provision that you have to do the work that you do, the rain that waters, again, the crops and makes it grow. They're just kind of, I think, living in this thankfulness, in this joy of God's provision that doesn't want them to forget. And I think that's really important. And then as well, this, as we're doing big picture stuff, verse 11. Then the Levites and the foreigners residing among you shall rejoice in all the good things that the Lord your God is given to you and your household. Because remember, they're sharing again and again and again. This every third year tithe, remember, is specifically set aside for the Levites who don't have land to grow, their crops on, for widows who don't have anyone to care for them, and for orphans, and for foreigners, people that aren't a part of the people of Israel, but are there amongst them, that they're to be provided for, because they also don't have their own land. So there's all kinds of provisions made for the vulnerable, for those who don't have, to be able to still experience the blessings, and to thank God, and to thank God's people for helping to provide for them. So this is really interesting stuff, just how frequently the widows and the orphans and the foreigners residing among you are just mentioned over and over and over and over again. Something that we should think about maybe some more as we consider how we might use in the same idea that God's provided for us, even a way to provide for ourselves, and that what it means to to share that with others. This, friends, will not be lost in the New Testament. Now, it may get lost because we choose not to focus on certain things, but in particular, I'll note when Paul picks up some of our responsibility to care for others, it flows from here pretty well. So follow the Lord's commands, of course, again and again and again, and then I will I'll try to wrap up here before too long. Chapter 27, this altar that's made on Mount Ebal, and so Mount Ebal, Mount Gerizim are opposite one another, and the village of Shechem, where Jacob's well is, modern day Nablus. I like to go there on our next trip. Hopefully we will be stopping there and seeing these things in person. Very cool stuff. The thing that I was thinking about here, these curses in chapter 27, so that they're basically, stating that I know that if I do these things, like, I'm not going to experience God's provision, God's favor, right? But what's fascinating to me is which things are included here, which things aren't included. So we're going through this big Old Testament story, a lot of different sections of instruction, of law, of Torah given. Some things are on the tablets of the Ten Commandments. Other things are additional things. There's things about the offerings. There's things about the clean and unclean. It's just interesting to me here which things are included and which things aren't. And there's not too many things that I think are really that objectionable to us, or the things that we're like, some of the things that we're like, okay, like, you don't get to eat certain things, like, it's hard for us to understand maybe, or you don't do two kinds of material in your clothing. Okay, like, the identity thing, like, we're tracking with that, but it's not. I just want to say that it seems interesting or significant to me that in this list of cursing, it doesn't say, and cursed be the one who wears the clothing with two things. Cursed be the one who eats the shrimp. Again, not to say that those things don't matter in the story, but what are the things that are highlighted here? It's also very possible, likely even, that there are things that are potential practices of the people around them that God's trying to separate them from, and other times just moral standards that kind of make sense. So also get the cup. Let's just kind of bop down through the list here. Chapter 27. Cursed is anyone. So the Levites recite to all the people of Israel in a loud voice from the mountain. Okay. Cursed is anyone who makes an idol. That by now should be a no-brainer. That is at the top of the list of no-nos on the Ten Commandments, everywhere else, again and again and again. Idolatry, do not do it. Cursed is anyone who dishonors their father and mother. Another big one, right? Big big Ten Commandment one. This one's interesting. Verse 17, cursed is anyone who moves their neighbor's boundary stone. Okay. So as they go in and the land gets allotted and you're like, oh, there's a stone here that marks off my land from my neighbor's land. I got more land, right? That's a big one. So would be easy to do. Was it commonly done? Perhaps, for it to be pointed out here. This is interesting. Verse 18, cursed is anyone who leads the blind astray on the road. Again, concern for another situation of a person who's vulnerable. People that are vulnerable, God says you take care of them. You don't take advantage of them. I think that's pretty significant here. Cursed is anyone who withholds justice from the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow. Interesting, the same thing. Maybe in the kind of the core group of the whatever people, like they can advocate for themselves. They have other family members to advocate for them. They've got more clout or whatever. Easier maybe to get away with taking advantage of the foreigner, the widow, the orphan or fatherless, as it's sometimes described or translated here. Those things that may be again easy to get away with. God says this is big. This is a big deal. You guys have to, you're. It's not going to be good if you take advantage of people in this way. There's some sexual mores, or whatever you want to put it here. It's interesting, again, which things are included, which things aren't included. I don't want to make too much or too little of that. But cursed is anyone who sleeps with his father's wife. Cursed is anyone who has sexual relations with any animal. You always got to wonder why that's in there. Oh my goodness. Cursed is anyone who sleeps with his sister, right? So incest. Again, these things aren't cursed as anyone who sleeps with his mother-in-law. Cursed is anyone who kills their neighbor secretly. Cursed is anyone who accepts a bribe to kill an innocent person. Cursed is anyone who does not uphold the words of this law by carrying them out. So that's kind of the catch-all. But again, I don't know. I just found that interesting. Again, not done a lot of research into these things. I'm just kind of processing them as thinking about them. So that's the curses. 28 is a long chapter of the blessings. The Lord, verse 9, chapter 28, the Lord will establish you as his holy people, as he promised you on oath, if you keep his commands of the Lord and walk in obedience to him. Then all the peoples of the earth will see that you are called by the name of the Lord, and they will fear you. The Lord will grant you abundant prosperity in the fruit of your womb, in the young of your livestock, in the crops of your ground, in the land he swore to your ancestors to give you. He will open the heavens and rain on your land in the season of. So let me. Somebody asked me a really good question. Is this prosperity gospel? Like, how is this different than if you have faith, if you trust God, if you do the right thing, then you get. It's a great question, because the prosperity gospel is a big problem today, and I think. On the one hand, there is a connection here between faithfulness and provision, but I think the major thing, or one major thing that separates this from that, is that this is survival. This is not the jumbo Learjet and the Maserati and the yacht and the your own island vacation stuff that gets wrapped up in the craziness of the prosperity gospel. This is more in the category of give us this day our daily bread. Okay, this is rain. If there's no rain, there's no crops. If there's no crops, there's no food. If there's no food, you don't eat. If you don't eat, you could die. And so this is not like insane stuff. This is like basic stuff, your livestock surviving, you having children. which is like, again, both the your family that can work together, as well as the future, taking care of you, all these things. These are the basics. No, I mean, it's a little bit more than the basics when it talks like eat and be satisfied or eat and be filled. But this to us is like raw bait. This is like having, there's a little bit more than you actually need to eat so that you can eat what you want and your tummy, you feel satisfied, not like I ate this and I'm not going to die, but it's whatever. So it's not, it's not this outrageous, lavish stuff. It's that God's going to provide what you need. Again, that the idea of the daily bread. I think that's really significant. Now, a lot of chapter 28, and I'm going to end here. Wow, this is a long one today. Sorry, not sorry. On that, a lot of chapter 28 looks forward to what's ultimately and I say look forward, I don't mean in a positive way. Looks forward in history to the great tragedies of this people. And that's that because of their, not just little things slipping, but because of their kind of continued ultimate, we'll see this as we go through the story, both idolatry, right, worshiping other gods, and things like perverting justice, not taking care of the vulnerable, but instead abusing them. We'll see in the prophets, these things come up again and again and again. And I've mentioned the idea that worship has consequences. So idolatry has consequences. The God you worship will shape the way that you live, is kind of the idea here. But we're looking forward to the terrible consequences of the piece in the story that we called exile. That, remember, along the story here, it's been this provision, this rescue, this land that you're being given is a gift, but it's not yours to possess, irrespective of responsibility. You're responsible to follow the Lord. You're responsible to take care of each other, to do what God says. And if they're gonna consistently and tragically be stiff-necked and refuse to do that, God's gonna say, in the story here, you're out of the land. At one point, or multiple points, I don't remember how often it shows up, but it said that the land will be given rest from you. Things like the land will vomit you out, like want rid of you because you're not taking care of it. You're not pursuing this peace, this overarching shalom that the Bible is so interested in. And so we're looking forward. We're looking in the future towards that, right, here in this, and wanting to provide that warning here in our canon, in our scripture. And this also, and finally this, wow, long today, always a lot to talk about. I think that this also makes sense of why in the time between the Testaments and in Jesus' time, people like the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, it helps us to explain why they were so serious about following God's law. They saw what happened when they did it. They were in exile. Now they were back, and they said, "We're not going to make that mistake again, right? We're going to be so serious that we're going to have, traditions that provide that fence around the law. Not because we're jerks, but because we want to make sure that we honor God." And they do some, that impulse works itself in some ways that aren't as healthy, and that Jesus will have some challenges too. But at the end of the day, knowing who God is, pursuing God, and living his way in the world is a piece that does not go away. God is as I've been saying, God is always rescuing, providing, and shaping a people to live a particular way, under his goodness and lordship, and that will come into focus with Jesus, but it won't go away. Jesus will redeem us. He'll rescue us. He'll provide for us, in one strong way of providing the empowerment of the Holy Spirit that will enable us to actually do what we weren't able to do throughout so much of the story. But then we're going to live a way so that people can see, right? This big picture throughout is that people can see how good God is. So often people have seen our hypocrisy and they've said, "Wow, why would I want to worship this God?" But instead, we're always being called into a life of love and goodness and provision that should and hopefully will cause other people to say, wow, this people is that loving. How can I be a part of that? So, all right, that's a lot today, guys. I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for hanging in, for some of you anyway. And hi to those who join later. Again, feel free to leave comments, questions. I'm not going to have all the answers, but I'm really interested in what you're wrestling with, what you're noticing, what's troubling you, what's, surprising joys to you along the way. So I'll see you guys soon. Thanks again. Love you all.